David Marshall, a successful self-made millionaire, had everything he could ever want. Yet something was missing, something money couldn't buy. But he would soon realize he might have been chasing the wrong dream all along. One evening, David found himself in an upscale restaurant surrounded by the city's elite. Business deals, laughter, and the clinking of glasses filled the air, but Lucas's mind was elsewhere. He was lost in thought, staring out of the floor-to-ceiling windows. His best friend, Mark, noticed. "What's got you so distracted?" Mark asked, leaning across the table, a wry smile on his lips. "You finally got everything. What's left?" David sighed, his fingers tracing the rim of his wine glass. "You know," David said, his voice low, "I feel empty, Mark. All this wealth, all this success. It doesn't mean anything if I don't leave a legacy." Mark raised an eyebrow. "You don't need a legacy, Lucas. You've got everything." But David wasn't satisfied. He wanted more than just riches. He wanted something he could call his own, something that would carry his name, his legacy, into the future. "I want a child," he declared suddenly, the words spilling out before he could stop them. Mark laughed. "A child? You can get any woman you want, Lucas." But David wasn't talking about just any woman. And that's when it happened. The crazy idea that would change everything. David Marshall was no stranger to wealth. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and instantly commanded attention. With his sharp suit, perfectly combed hair, and piercing blue eyes, he embodied the definition of success. But despite his wealth and status, something inside him felt incomplete. He had the mansions, the cars, the private jets, and the admiration of everyone around him. But there was no real connection, no one to share it with. He was a man driven by ambition and work, someone who had built everything from the ground up, often at the expense of relationships. Friends came and went, business partners were transient, and love, well, that was something he'd never really understood. The closest he'd come to a meaningful relationship was with his reflection in the mirror, and even that seemed increasingly hollow. Mark Carter, his childhood friend, and the one person who had always been around, watched David with a mixture of admiration and concern. They had been inseparable in their younger days, but now, Mark couldn't help but feel like an outsider in Lucas's world. While David moved through life as if he could control everything, Mark had always been the more grounded one. Someone who believed that life was about connection and love, not just material success. "So, how are you planning on making this child happen?" Mark asked, his voice teasing but with a hint of concern. David smiled, his eyes narrowing with a mischievous gleam. "That's where you come in." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Oh? How's that?" "I need a surrogate," David said. "Someone who can carry my child, but not just any surrogate. I want someone who will give me a child, no questions asked. Someone who is desperate." Mark's expression turned serious. "Lucas, what are you talking about?" The idea that had been festering in Lucas's mind for weeks was now taking shape. He knew it sounded crazy, but deep down, he was convinced it would work. He would pay a homeless woman to have his child. There would be no emotions, no attachments, just a transaction. He could finally leave his legacy behind without the complications of love or relationships. Mark was stunned. "You can't be serious. You're talking about exploiting someone for your own gain." David leaned back in his chair, his face hardening. "It's not exploitation. I'm offering them a way out, a fresh start. This child will change everything for them, too." Mark wasn't convinced. "Lucas, you've always been about control, about having everything your way, but this isn't going to go how you think." But David was undeterred. "You're wrong, Mark. This is going to work. Trust me." David wasted no time. His determination to leave a legacy burned brighter than ever. He contacted agencies, lawyers, and even went undercover in the streets, searching for the perfect candidate. It was cold, heartless work, but it felt necessary. Every day he was faced with the realities of his choices, and each rejection, each failed attempt, only pushed him further down this dark path. He needed someone desperate, someone who wouldn't ask questions. But when he first met Chloe, everything changed. Chloe was not like the others. She wasn't begging on street corners or asking for spare change. She was a survivor, someone who lived day to day with the raw, unforgiving world at her back. Her clothes were torn, her face was gaunt, but her eyes held something different, an unshakable resilience. She was a woman who had been through more than most people could imagine, and it showed in her hardened stare. David approached her one chilly evening in the park, where she sat on a bench, alone. The glow of the nearby street lamp barely illuminated her, but her presence stood out to him like a beacon. He knew instantly she was the one. "Excuse me," David began, his voice steady. "I have an offer for you." Chloe looked up, her gaze sharp and wary. "I don't want your charity," she snapped, her voice filled with a mix of pride and defensiveness. David was taken aback. Most people would have been humbled by his wealth, desperate for a chance to escape their circumstances, but Chloe wasn't like most people. "I'm not offering charity," he said, trying to sound calm. "I'm offering you a way out, a chance to change your life." Chloe's eyes narrowed. "And what's the catch?" David hesitated, unsure of how to explain what he was asking without sounding insane. "I want to pay you to have my child." She froze. Her eyes scanned his face, trying to read him, trying to figure out if he was serious. She didn't flinch, didn't scoff. She simply stood up and walked away without saying a word. David stood there stunned. He had expected a reaction, but not this. He had underestimated her, and that moment hit him harder than he cared to admit. The next few days were a blur of meetings and calls. He couldn't get Chloe out of his mind, and the thought of her rejecting him so easily gnawed at him. There was something about her that didn't fit into his calculated world. Eventually, Chloe reached out to him. She wanted to meet again. When they sat down at a rundown cafe, Chloe's expression had softened, but she was still guarded. "I've been thinking about your offer," she began slowly, "and I still think you're crazy. But I need the money, and maybe you're right. Maybe I could change my life with this, so I'll do it." David was taken aback by her calm acceptance. He had expected some resistance, some argument, but there was none. Only a quiet resignation in her voice. "All right," David said, still unsure how to navigate this unfamiliar situation. "The terms are simple. You carry my child, no strings attached. After the birth, you'll receive a large sum of money. You can leave and live your life however you choose." Chloe nodded, but her face remained unreadable. "And you won't tell anyone?" she asked, her eyes locking onto his. David hesitated for a moment. "Of course. There will be no record of this. You'll be free to go. No one will know." As the days passed, David found himself growing more and more fixated on the arrangement. The cold, transactional nature of it all seemed perfect to him. There were no emotions, no complications. He wasn't a man who had room for love, and he certainly wasn't going to allow anyone to control him. Not now, not ever. But as Chloe's pregnancy progressed, strange things started to happen. His feelings, which he had long buried beneath layers of arrogance and pride, began to stir. He started noticing her more, the way her hair caught the light, the way her eyes sparkled when she talked about her past, and even the way she seemed to understand him in a way no one else ever had. It was unsettling, this shift inside him. He wasn't supposed to care about her. She was just a means to an end, a tool to fulfill his goal. But with each passing day, that line between detachment and something more started to blur. And then, something happened that David couldn't have foreseen. Chloe, who had always been distant, started opening up to him. Her tough exterior began to crack, revealing the pain and struggle she had faced in her life. She shared stories of the abuse she had suffered, the trauma of losing her family, and the long, lonely years spent on the streets. She was no longer just a means to an end for Lucas. She became something more, a human being, a woman who had her own dreams, her own pain, and her own worth. But just when David thought he might understand her, just when he thought they were starting to connect, Chloe pulled away. She became distant again, her emotions locked behind the walls she had spent years building. The tension between them was palpable. David felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. Was this really the life he had wanted? Was he willing to trade all his wealth for the emptiness he felt inside? And more importantly, could he live with the consequences of what he had done? The months passed in a blur of appointments, hospital visits, and increasingly tense exchanges between David and Chloe. With every passing day, Chloe's pregnancy grew more obvious, and David found himself visiting her more often. Initially, his intentions had been clear. He just wanted to ensure the deal was fulfilled. But now, with each conversation, each glimpse of Chloe's growing belly, he felt a change inside himself that he couldn't ignore. It was as though she was starting to matter, and that realization hit him harder than he expected. But then came the night of the ultrasound. It was a cold evening in late fall, and the hospital waiting room was dimly lit. David had shown up early, eager to see the ultrasound results, to confirm that everything was progressing smoothly. Chloe was late, and as the minutes ticked by, his impatience grew. He stood by the window, staring out at the darkened streets below, the weight of the city pressing in on him. When she finally walked in, she didn't look like herself. Her usual tough exterior was gone, replaced with something far more fragile, almost defeated. "Everything okay?" David asked, his voice softer than usual. Chloe didn't answer immediately. She walked past him and sat down in the chair, staring at the ground. The silence between them was thick with tension. "Chloe," David said, approaching her cautiously. "What's going on?" Finally, she looked up at him. Her eyes were filled with tears, but there was something else, something that David couldn't quite place. A sense of guilt, fear, regret. "Lucas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something." His heart skipped a beat. For a moment, he feared the worst, that something had happened to the baby, that the deal was about to fall apart. "Tell me what?" he demanded, his voice rising, panic creeping into his tone. Chloe took a deep breath and then blurted out the words that would forever change everything. "The baby is yours, but not in the way you think." David froze, the words hanging in the air between them like a terrible storm cloud. He blinked, trying to process what she had said. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice strained. "Of course the baby is mine. You're carrying it for me just like we agreed." Chloe shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. "That's not what I mean. The baby isn't yours by blood, Lucas. It's my brother's." David felt the world shift beneath him. The ground seemed to tilt, and for a moment he thought he might collapse. "Your brother's?" he whispered. Chloe nodded, her lips trembling. "Yes, my brother. He was the one who got me pregnant. I didn't want to tell you, but I couldn't keep it a secret anymore. I was going to raise the baby myself, but when you offered the money, I thought it would be a way to start fresh, to get out of the hell I've been living in." The room felt suffocating, the air heavy with shock. David stumbled back, his mind reeling from the revelation. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You're telling me you lied to me?" His voice shook with disbelief. "I didn't lie to you, Lucas," Chloe said, her voice steady now, though her hands trembled in her lap. "I just didn't tell you the whole truth. I didn't tell you about my brother, about the abuse. I didn't tell you because I thought you would walk away. But now you know, and you have a choice to make." A silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Lucas's mind raced as he tried to make sense of everything. How could he have missed the signs? How could he have been so blind? "I didn't know, Chloe," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "I had no idea. I thought I was helping you." "You were," she said softly, her voice carrying a note of sadness. "But now you know the truth. And the truth is, it's not just about the money. It's about something more than that. I don't know if I can trust you, Lucas. I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore." David stood there, rooted to the spot, the weight of her words crashing down on him. He had come to this situation with selfish intentions, thinking it was all just a transaction. But now, everything was more complicated, more raw than he had ever anticipated. Chloe stood up, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "I need to go, Lucas. I need to figure out what to do with all of this. I don't know if I can trust you anymore. But I do know one thing. This baby, it's not just yours. It's mine too. And I will raise it no matter what." And with that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving David standing there, shattered by the truth he had never seen coming. The days that followed were a blur. David couldn't escape the weight of Chloe's revelation. The truth gnawed at him like a constant biting wind, impossible to ignore. Every time he looked at the reflection in the mirror, he didn't recognize the man staring back at him. The arrogance, the selfishness, it was all there, in full force. But now, those qualities seemed hollow, like the remnants of someone who had never truly lived, never truly understood what it meant to care for another human being. He tried to focus on his business, on his empire, the one he'd built from the ground up. But nothing felt right. It felt as though the walls of his pristine penthouse were closing in on him. The city's lights no longer offering comfort, but instead mocking him. The success he'd once felt so proud of now seemed insignificant in the face of the mess he had created. One morning, after days of agonizing over what to do, David found himself driving to Chloe's apartment. He didn't know what he was going to say. How could he? But he knew he had to face her. He needed to apologize, to make things right, even if he wasn't sure how. When he arrived, Chloe's apartment was quiet. There was no sign of her at first, and for a moment he thought he might be too late, that she had already disappeared from his life forever. But then, from down the hallway, he heard the soft sound of crying. His heart sank. He knew it was her. He walked down the hallway, hesitated at the door, and then knocked gently. The crying stopped, and after a long pause, Chloe's voice floated through the door. "Go away, Lucas." It stung, but David wasn't going to back down. Not now. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice steady. "I need to talk to you. Please." There was a long silence, and then the door creaked open. Chloe stood there, her face red from tears, but her posture was resolute. She wasn't the broken woman he had seen that night. She was stronger now, harder, as though something inside her had shifted too. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice strained. "I need to apologize, Chloe," David said, his gaze unwavering. "I was selfish, and I didn't see what really mattered. I was so caught up in my own world, I couldn't see you. I couldn't see the truth. But I see it now. I know I can't change the past, but I want to be there for you, for the baby, for both of you." Chloe's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "And why should I believe you now? After everything?" David took a deep breath, his chest heavy with emotion. "Because I've learned something that I never understood before. Money and success, they don't mean anything if you don't have people who care about you. I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose this chance to do better, to be better." There was a long pause. The silence between them was thick with the weight of everything unsaid, but Chloe's eyes softened ever so slightly. "You don't have to prove anything to me," she said quietly, her voice full of emotion. "Just show me that you're serious. Show me that you'll be there for us no matter what." And that was all David needed. He didn't have to have all the answers, but in that moment, he made a vow. A vow to be there for Chloe and the baby, to take responsibility, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Over the weeks that followed, David slowly began to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. He wasn't perfect, far from it, but he was trying. He spent more time with Chloe, not just as a benefactor, but as someone who genuinely cared. They shared meals together, talked for hours, and though it wasn't easy, there was a quiet understanding between them. As the months passed and Chloe's due date drew near, David found himself genuinely excited about the baby. He had gone from a man who saw everything as transactional to a man who was ready to give, to love unconditionally. The day the baby was born was a turning point. David stood in the hospital room, holding the newborn in his arms, his heart swelling with emotions he hadn't known he was capable of. The little one was perfect in every way, a new beginning, a symbol of growth and redemption. And as Chloe watched him with a cautious yet hopeful gaze, David knew that this was the moment his life would never be the same. He wasn't just a wealthy businessman anymore. He was a father, and more importantly, he was someone who had learned that love and responsibility mattered more than anything else. And so, David began a new chapter in his life, one that was filled with uncertainty but also hope. He had come to understand the power of empathy, the weight of his actions, and the importance of being there for others, not out of obligation, but out of genuine care. As the years passed, David would never forget the lessons he had learned during those difficult months. The money, the success, the empire, they were all fleeting. But the relationships he built, the lives he touched, those were the things that truly mattered. And as he watched his child grow, he knew that this was the greatest gift of all, the gift of transformation, of redemption, and of love. What would you have done if you were in Lucas's shoes? Do you think it's possible for someone to truly change? Share your thoughts in the comments below.